Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Cancer Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. Welcome. I'm here, one of my writers, in this case, Danny. Thank you, Danny. He's written me a script. The Ballad of Kate Webster, the Richmond murderess. Okay, murderess. Didn't even know that was a title, but here we go. The format of the show, I've never read this before. We're going to explore it together, dear audience. Let's jump in. Something nasty rose to the surface of the River Thames in the early morning of March the 5th, 1879, near Victorian London. And as this was several years too early for supermarket shopping trolleys and traffic cones, we have to assume whatever was bobbing up and down in the water held slightly more sinister secrets than the aftermath of a drunken night out down at the Three Jolly Bakers. I don't know, if there's one thing about humans, you could bet that today we throw trolleys and traffic cones in the river. You could bet they'd throw whatever the equivalent of those were in the river back in the day, because teenagers are always going to be teenagers, aren't they? The discovery of a foot-long corded wooden box was first made. Why is a corded wooden box? By the coal porter Henry Wheatley, who just happened to be driving his horse and cart past Barnes Railway Bridge in southwest London at around 6:45 a.m. Henry initially wondered if he'd stumbled upon the loot from a robbery, but he may have felt a bit disappointed after alighting from his cart to open the box. Alighting is one of those words that I learned what it meant way too late in life. I'm like just riding around the London Underground. I must have been like, I think it was 21, 22, just riding around the London Underground, and it's like, alight here for, I don't know, King's Cross or whatever, and you're like, okay, I don't know what that means. But it means change. It means like get off. Sorry, not change. It means get off, like alight. And I'm like, oh, okay. Word in common usage that I learned in my 20s. As the contents looked decidedly meaner than your typical treasure trove of shiny valuables. If anybody had committed a robbery here, Henry assumed that the criminals must have broken into a local butcher's and stolen all of the cut-offs during a remarkably less than ambitious operation, as all he could see was a mass of white flesh. Yes, that's what's in the box. It's stuff from a robbery of a butcher's store, and people just didn't want the cheap meats or whatever, so they put them in a box and threw them in the river. It's much more likely to be that than a body, Henry, isn't it? Well done. As I'm sure you've already guessed, that mass of white flesh didn't belong to anything you'd have found in a respectable law-abiding butcher's. Jesus, even the non-law-abiding butchers, I'd rather hope they were like, I don't know, selling rat meat rather than humans. It was the remains of a woman, a boiled up body missing the entrails, a few limbs and a head. Why would you boil it? What are you doing? A missing foot turned up just a few days later, buried in a dung heap on an allotment in Twickenham, about 5 miles away from the original discovery. And whilst it was clear to police that the foot and boiled remains belonged to the same female victim, it wasn't quite so easy to figure out the identity of the victim without the head. And this had friends and family members of the 55-year-old Julia Martha Thomas quite worried. Julia, a widower who lived with her maid in a fancy house in Richmond, London, Richmond, nice neighbourhood, with pretty close proximity to both discoveries. Well, actually, I don't know. Like, when was this? Late 1800s? I don't know. Maybe Richmond was a shithole back then, but probably not. It is Richmond. She'd been strangely quiet for the last few days. The neighbours hadn't seen anything at all of Julia, whilst her brother Charles was concerned that she had uncharacteristically failed to show up for their last engagement without a word. Perhaps some people were in too much of a rush to make hasty connections between the apparently missing Julia Thomas and the recently discovered remains. During a later inquest, Dr. Adams concluded that the remains belonged to a young woman between the ages of 18 and 30, which rules out Julia Thomas by at least 25 years. Well, there you go, but I get the feeling there's more to this, because otherwise we wouldn't be mentioning Julia Thomas, would we, Danny? Something's happened to her. Besides, although some of her friends and family members hadn't been seen for a few days, Julia had reportedly been as busy as a bee during this period and was very much attending to pressing business. I get the feeling she's not attending to pressing business and that she's dead. It's just my vibe. Yet there was indeed a twisted... Oh no, is she the murderer? Yet there was indeed a twisted connection waiting to be uncovered, as the locals and the press became enthralled by the Barnes mystery and pondered over the true identity of the sticky mess that had washed up under the railway bridge. Oof. It's a story that involves an Irish maid who enjoyed a tipple, lumps of boiled human fat which were allegedly sold to pub landlords as dipping pork and given away to young urchins as a tasty treat. An unusual case of pleading the belly to avoid a potential death penalty, and an enlightening final accidental discovery made over 130 years later by none other than the legendary naturalist and broadcaster Sir David Attenborough. What is today's episode, Danny? This is the Ballad of the Richmond Murderess, and some of the lyrics are not for the faint of heart. The dignity of labour. Before we can tell the story of Julia Thomas, we first need to turn our attention to one of the many maids who endured a typically short employment at number 2 Mayfield Cottages in Richmond, London, before being given the boot for not being quite up to scratch. I wonder if 2 Mayfield Cottages still exists. This is the interesting thing about London. You can look up these addresses. We had Ancestry as a sponsor a while back, and I remember finding where all my great-great-grandfather would live, and you'd look it up and it's oh, that house is still there. You'd be oh, wow. In London, it's probably divided into 700 flats by now, but let's have a look. 2 Mayfield Cottages. There it is. Mayfield Cottages. Oh, there's no longer number 2, but yeah, there it is. There it is. Okay. I don't know which house. They've obviously renumbered the streets at some point, but there are the Mayfield Cottages. Fascinating. Not as quite exciting as being able to look up the exact building immediately, but there we go. Life in England was never likely to be easy for Kate Webster when she first caught the ferry across the Irish Sea at the age of 18. Following the Great Irish Potato Famine... Oh my god, wait. Is Kate Webster... She's going to be the... Oh no, she's the murderess. Wait, what was the title of this episode? The Ballad of Kate Webster, the Richmond Murderess. Okay, so the maid is the murderer. And has she murdered Julia Thomas? But Julia Thomas is too old to have been the victim. I shouldn't be trying to work it out this early in the episode. We haven't even got into the main story yet, and I'm trying to figure out who did it.
It makes no damn sense. Compels me, though.
When she first caught the ferry across the Irish Sea at the age of 18. Following the Great Irish Potato Famine of 1849 to 1852, England had witnessed a huge surge in Irish immigrants fleeing their infected native soil to seek better conditions over the sea. But they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. Back then, the Irish were often greeted with widespread prejudice and were usually denounced as violent, dim-witted criminal drunks. That seems a bit harsh to say the least, and the situation was hardly helped by the fact that the British police were heavily targeting the Irish communities at the time, leading to a disproportionate number of Irish convictions and incarcerations, and further fueling the anti-Irish sentiment. I'm hoping that young Kate Webster may have managed to defy prejudiced expectations when she first arrived in England to build a new life. I mean, she enjoyed a good drink, a good stiff drink, maybe 5 or 10 of them, just to get started before the proper evening session got underway. Holy shit. Yes, a phrase I really like is yeah, we could go out for a drink or 5. It's a drink or 2, but you say a drink or 5. I don't even drink that much, but I like the joke, so I often say it. And it's fair to say that she probably wasn't the brightest bulb in the box. Oh, and she'd had 1 or 2 brushes with the law, and when I say 1 or 2, I mean hundreds. Holy shit. She was in and out of prison more times than you'll be able to count on your fingers before she tried to nick your wristwatch. She occasionally got embroiled in drunken slugfests too, and usually came out on top. Look, to be honest, I don't think Kate Webster is going to be much good in challenging any stereotypes here. We can't even really trust the accuracy of her own version of her life story or her own name. It's believed that she was born Kate Lawler in 1849 in the village of Killan in County Wexford, Ireland in 1849, although she would go under many different surnames in later years, including Gibbs, Gibbons, Webb, and Webster. According to Kate, the Webster name came from a salty sea captain she married and with whom she had 4 children, but her husband and children all died under mysterious circumstances that she didn't like to talk about. Uh-oh, when your episode title on The Catch of Criminals is Murderess, I'm thinking you probably killed your family. And this is so long ago, I don't need to say allegedly. I can just be I think you murdered your children. But not many folk buy into that story, and she may well have said that they were all gobbled alive by an Irish sea dragon. The facts of which we're far more confident is that Kate started out as a young pickpocket in Killan and was first arrested for larceny and sentenced to a stint in Wexford jail, spelt Gaol because it was the past, at the age of just 15. 3 years later, she decided to leave Ireland behind and take the ferry to Liverpool in England, but only after she'd managed to steal the fare. Of course, how else are you going to get anywhere? Her arrival in a new country may have been the point where Webster shed her childhood criminal roots and forged a fresh start. But no, within the space of less than a year, she'd been caught pickpocketing again and served a 4-year sentence in prison for pickpocketing. And this is going to be one of her first offences in the country, right? It's not like it's the past. They're not going to be reaching out to the Irish authorities, who they probably don't have brilliant relationships with, and ask for a criminal record, are they? 4 years. Goddamn. Upon her release in 1872, she travelled to London to find good respectable work as a cleaner and maid after presumably having finally learned her lesson. She settled down in a modest house on Rose Gardens in Hammersmith, where she befriended the Porter family, who loom large later on in the tale. Frank and Anne Porter were good neighbours who always looked out for Kate and often invited her round for dinner, whilst Kate developed a bond with their young children. But Kate was still struggling to stay on the straight and narrow, and that's putting it mildly. In her new capacity as a cleaner, she developed an unfortunate unfortunate tendency of cleaning out the entire contents of her employer's house before legging it and moving on to the next unfortunate sucker. Yeah, I was going to say, like, the person who you want cleaning is probably not the person who went to prison for theft, because, that's a perfect opportunity for theft. But then a new bundle of joy arrived in Kate Webster's life in 1874 in the form of a baby son who was given the name John W. Webster. If we're to believe Kate's earlier story, then this would have been the 5th time that she'd given birth, although it's probably more likely that John was her first and only child. Oh, okay, so she didn't murder her family. She didn't have a family, she just made it up. We're not sure of the exact identity of the father, as Kate ended up naming 3 completely different men. But the most likely candidate was a man known only as Mr. Strong, a criminal and occasional accomplice who scarpered as soon as he found out that Kate was pregnant. Classy guy, that Mr. Strong. Still, now that Kate Webster had new parental responsibilities to consider, maybe this would be the long-awaited turning point at which she turned over a new leaf and carved out an honest future for herself and her new child. Yeah, that's just not going to happen, is it? If anything, Kate felt Mr. Strong's abrupt departure had forced her into committing further crimes to support herself and baby John. It has to be said that Kate Webster clearly wasn't very good at this crime lark, though, particularly the not getting caught element. Before John was even celebrating his first birthday, his mother was back behind bars yet again, this time serving an 18-month sentence in Wandsworth prison for no less than 36 charges of larceny. Wait, she went to prison for 4 years for pickpocketing. And 36 charges of larceny, 18 months? What's going on? Also, who's looking after a kid? Okay, here we go. During this period, John was looked after by Kate's new friend, Sarah Crease, an honest cleaner or charwoman who worked in the Richmond area and managed to get through her shifts without ever stealing anything. Yeah, because, back in the day, life is really hard. And I get the feeling that if you get fired, you're going to be wondering where food's going to be coming from. Stealing and getting fired would be bad, and it's probably not like the people could just fire you, right? Because it's the past. This friendship was maintained after Kate was eventually released from prison. And Kate, bloody well should be, she looked after your son for 18 months. And Kate agreed to cover her friend's cleaning job when Sarah was temporarily taken ill. It's the least you could do. Kate briefly worked for Sarah's mistress, Miss Lucy Loader in Richmond, and it seems that Kate just about managed to get through the days without shafting her employer this time, perhaps out of loyalty to Sarah. It would have seemed a bit mean to drop your mate right in the shit after they'd just raised your toddler for 18 months. Yes, exactly. Kate must have done a good job anyway, as Ms. Loader was impressed enough by her work to heartily recommend her services to a good neighbour in the Richmond area who was on the lookout for a new live-in housemaid. The neighbour was Julia Martha Thomas. Julia was a 55-year-old former school teacher who had been widowed twice. Since the death of her second husband in 1873, she'd been living alone at 2 Mayfield Cottages, a nice 2-story villa with large gardens and walking distance to a popular pub by the name of The Hole in the Wall. Really? It's kind of a great name for a pub. She didn't usually live entirely alone, as she employed the services of a housemaid, but they didn't tend to hang around for very long as they failed to meet up to Julia's meticulously high standards. She sounds like quite a complex character, and she's described in many conflicting ways by her friends, neighbors, and associates. It's often said that she was quite a twitchy mouse-like woman who wouldn't say boo to a goose, but interesting turn of phrase. But she must have had some balls to serve as a teacher in Victorian London for most of her life, and as it turns out, she wasted no time in telling the housemaids where to get off when they couldn't reach the desired levels of utter perfection. Her own doctor recalled Julia's excitable temperament, whilst some other neighbours regarded her as something of an eccentric who could occasionally become difficult and confrontational. Yeah, she is an old person. Old people, I swear, old people get older. I see it with my grandparents and parents. It's old people get older and they just get more confrontational for some reason. I don't know why. I feel like as I've got older, I've got less confrontational. I'm just I don't know, whatever. You do you, okay? You do you, I'll do me. After reading up on all the differing accounts of her characteristics, I'm left with the impression of a nervous church-going fusspot who generally minded her own business and kept to herself, but this mouse could roar if anyone started taking the piss or wasn't doing their job properly. It's also speculated that she may have been living slightly below her means. While she had accrued a little wealth from 2 dead husbands, she wasn't exactly rolling around in money, yet she insisted on living slightly beyond her means. I think I read that as below. She was in flashing off expensive new jewelry in public. Okay, and she probably didn't even need a maid at all. Considering the frequent problems she experienced with her servants, she would have been better off doing the work herself to her own exacting standards. Yeah, but also no. I've had people who there's people who work for me or whatever, and it's like, oh, it's not as good a job as I would do, but it's good enough. Like, I'm not gonna just because I don't know, and I don't know, so I don't have the most exacting standards. I don't even know what I'm talking about. But doing the work yourself is like, that's really hard. You don't want to have to do work yourself. That sounds like way too much effort. But it was more about elevating her status than any practical requirements. After all, every well-to-do person should have at least one maid, even if you think you could do the job better yourself. Perhaps this is why she had so many problems in this department. So many problems, in fact, that when she placed yet another advertisement for a new maid in the local newspaper in January 1879, she didn't get a single response, probably because word had got around that she was a total pain in the arse to work with. But her neighbour, Lucy Loader, came to the rescue with news of a perfectly good housemate by the name of Kate Webster, who was currently looking for a permanent position. Miss Loader's recommendation was good enough for Julia, who had apparently hired the now 29-year-old Kate Webster on the spot without bothering to check up on her somewhat murky past. I mean, people always say that, like, you didn't check up on their past. It's like, I don't know. I don't think I've ever done a background check on anyone. It's like, I don't know, it's just, I mean, maybe it doesn't seem necessary. I could have terrible drug barons working for me. I mean, probably not, other than maybe Danny. Kate moved into 2 Mayfield cottages on the 29th of January, 1879, whilst the now 5-year-old John stayed behind with Sarah Crease, but still received frequent visits from his mum during her time off work. It's said that mistress and servant hit it off quite well. To begin with, at least, the pair would have made an unlikely-looking duo if they'd ever hit the town together, which, of course, they didn't. Whilst the small and fidgety Julia Thomas looked as if she was in danger of getting blown into the road by a mild gust of wind, the rugged and square-jawed Kate Webster had a stocky and muscular build and was described in the press as being quite breathtakingly masculine. She does kind of look like a bare-knuckle boxer in a bonnet. However, the friendship between the pair didn't last much more than about a week. Although Kate initially found Julia to be a nice old lady, she soon found her new employer to be something of a tough taskmaster. Also, after Kate had finished her chores, Julia would march around the house and point out everything that she'd done wrong and every tiny patch of dust that she'd missed. Meanwhile, Julia was less than impressed with how much her new maid liked to drink. You see, Kate had discovered that the house was within staggering distance of the hole in the wall, and she often used to nip over there in the evenings and come back stinking drunk to a thoroughly disapproving Mrs. Thomas. It's her free time, though. If she wants to get outrageously drunk, as long as she's doing the job, who are you to interfere? The situation was becoming so bad that Julia reportedly began inviting friends round much more regularly, purely because she didn't like to be alone with her own maid. All right, well, that's a different vibe. If she's like scaring you when she's drunk, then it's like, okay, I see why that's a problem. But if she's just going up to her room, passing out on the bed, it doesn't affect you.
Oh, what a shout of puff!
Things reached a head after just a few weeks when Kate enjoyed a day off to spend some time with her son, but then popped into the hole in the wall on the way home and finally returned to the house absolutely wankered. That's what we're led to believe anyway. I'm not sure Kate really got that drunk or belligerent at all, or whether the prim and proper Julia couldn't even just bear the slightest hint of a servant's boozy breath in her own home. The incident sparked a major row, which resulted in Julia giving Kate notice to leave by the end of the month. That's going to be uncomfortable. You're fired, but you got to stick around for the rest of the month. In that case, just pay them. Just pay them off. Just be like, here's your month's wages. Please don't come in tomorrow. Because otherwise it's going to be extremely uncomfortable and maybe she'll murder you. Kate later begged Julia for an extension of just 3 days so that she could get her affairs in order over the course of the final weekends, and Julia agreed to this brief extension, terminating her employment on Sunday the 2nd of March, 1879. It all sounds as if this may have had some sort of deep, life-changing impact on Julia Thomas. Within the space of a few weeks, it appeared that she'd decided to sell up and move on, ideally to somewhere that wasn't so close to one of those wretched pubs, and she may have been looking to downsize, as she didn't intend to take everything with her. It's a little bit suspicious, isn't it? A publican by the name of John Church dispatched a couple of delivery carts to the property on March the 18th, after having made an agreement with Mrs. Thomas to buy a load of furniture and other assorted bits and pieces, some of which would look quite snazzy in his Hammersmith pub, the Rising Sun. But what John Church could never have known is that there was something distinctly odd about the events that were unfolding, and all was not quite as it seemed. If this upstanding publican had been really keen to pursue a legitimate deal with Julia Martha Thomas, he may have been better off trying to communicate with the mass of white flesh that had been discovered a few days earlier in a corded wooden box in the River Thames. Oh my. Wait, so it is her? It's just the coroner got the age wrong or something? I mean, it was the past. Being boiled. The final official day of Kate Webster's employment at 2 Mayfield cottages hadn't gone down terribly well. Kate had taken off the first half of Sunday to see her son, but had agreed to return later in the day to help Julia prepare for the evening service at the local church. But would you believe it? Kate called into the hole in the wall again on the way back home and returned back to the house late and worse for the wear. By this time, she may not have felt that she had anything to lose, seeing as she'd be out of a job and a home by the next day. However, this final evening panned out. A deeply irritated Julia was far from impressed about the delay on her schedule and eventually scuttled off to church to catch what she still could of the service. Fellow members of the congregation observed that her appearance was unusually disheveled and that she appeared to be in a state of great agitation. I would have hoped that an evening of worship and prayer and absolutely banging tunes on the organ might have calmed Julia down a bit before she returned home to her errand maid at around 9 p.m, but it seems that both parties were still in a stinking mood and Kate very much had an axe to grind with her soon-to-be former mistress. Uh-oh, she's gonna grind that axe and then use it on her body. It's often reported by quite credible sources that Kate was literally wielding an axe when Julia returned home, but there's no concrete evidence of this. From what we can piece together, what appears to have happened is that the pair got involved in yet another heated argument at the top of the stairs, which eventually led to Webster throwing her mistress down the stairs in anger. Possibly concerned that the subsequent screaming from Julia might alert the neighbors, Webster then apparently lost the plot and rushed down the stairs to strangle Julia Martha Thomas to death. I mean, in for a penny, in for a pound. This left Webster with the age-old problem of what to do with the body. And here is where things got pretty messy. She dismembered the corpse with a razor. Oh, a meat saw and a carving knife. I was like, she just chopped the head off with a razor? That's a lot of work. And at some point removed the head entirely from the body. She opened the stomach and removed the organs and intestines, which were tossed into the roaring kitchen fire, whilst the rest of the body was thrown into a large copper pot full of boiling water, which was commonly used for washing laundry. This extremely grim. After bringing the remains of Julia Thompson to the boil, Webster became quite overcome by the foul stench that was now emanating from both the bubbling body in the copper pot and the burning entrails in the fireplace. She also developed a bit of a thirst. So she decided... Oh no, this is definitely one of the rules. You can't get drunk when disposing of a body. I don't know what rule number it is, but it's one of the rules. For a few stiff drinks to calm her nerves and consider her next move. It may have seemed like a bit of an odd moment to call into the pub again for another session on the lash, but she may have been working on the old folk wisdom that a watched pot never boils. Oh, Danny! Even though I can confirm that this is not scientifically correct. No, and that pot was boiling. It was boiling her flesh. When she finally staggered back to the house late at night, Webster then stuffed most of the body into a corded wooden box and put some limbs into a Gladstone bag, a vintage stiff leather portmanteau suitcase. And that still left the head and one foot, which she'd have to deal with separately. Why'd she cut off one random foot? Could she not fit her in the pot? How big is this pot? Or how small is the Julia lady? Webster then began scrubbing down the entire crime scene to try and wipe away any evidence of the atrocities that had just taken place at 2 Mayfield cottages. I mean, good plan. Other than the drinking, this is not a bad disposal of the body plan, especially for back in the day. I'm not sure why you had to cut her open though and burn her insides but then boil the rest of her body. That's a bit psycho. It's at this point that we should address the widely shared allegations that she scooped up big lumps of the body fat and began distributing it around the neighborhood as pork or beef dripping. I realize that dripping is a distinctively British term. Oh, okay, I didn't know that was just British. What do you call it elsewhere? But the rest of the world will hopefully have a closer idea what we're talking about if I describe it as a relative of lard or tallow. They're not quite the same thing. Oh, I kind of thought that lard was dripping. I would imagine that most normal people wouldn't tuck into a solid block of lard whenever they felt a bit peckish, aside from my mate Big Graham, and would be more likely to consider it as a cooking ingredient. In contrast, bread and dripping is a reasonably acceptable example of vintage fine British cuisine, as dripping refers to the slightly more flavoursome fat which is collected from pork and beef as the meat cooks. Yeah, it's weird, but this is delicious. My grandparents used to go mad for it, but I always passed on the offer and asked for a fish finger sandwich instead. No, I like this. I think it's delicious. It's obviously not very good for you. It's a lot of calories, but it is delicious. It's kind of like those crisps that are pork rinds. Pork rinds? Do you have those in America? They're like the skin and the bit of fat from a pig or whatever that's kind of fried up. And for some reason you can buy them in a bag like crisps, which is kind of gross when you think about it, but it's delicious. But anyway, the story goes that Webster collected some of the fat from the remains of Julia Thomas and went round all the pubs in the area where she sold it as the tastiest dripping in town, leading to a possibility that some of Richmond's residents may have unwittingly eaten their own neighbour. I mean, this doesn't seem very likely. I mean, how much fat is old Julia going to have on her? She seems like a mousy old woman. She's probably just mostly sinew. Sinew? Whether she was later feeling charitable or just trying to get rid of the last bit of stock, she then apparently gave it away to street urchins for free, even throwing in a few chunks of bread to go with it. This was a story that got reported several times in the contemporary press and was even publicly repeated as probable fact quite recently in 2010 by Detective Inspector David Bolton during a period when the case had surprisingly re-emerged in the news. Oh, is this the David Attenborough thing? What did he discover? But we only have the word of a couple of witnesses, a street urchin and an unnamed landlady to go on here, and these claims were notably made several months after the event when the main story had died down, which almost suggests that the press may just have been looking for a new angle, or at least taking too much notice of stories from the street. Criminology author Leonard Gribble is certainly not convinced the bits of Julia Thomas were cheerfully spread onto chunks of bread. As he puts it, there is no acceptable evidence that such a repulsive sale was ever made, and it is more than possible that the episode belongs rightfully with the rest of the vast collection of apocryphal stories that has accumulated not unnaturally about the persons and deeds of famous criminals. So although this particularly ghastly ingredient often gets peppered into half-boiled accounts of the saga, it would appear that this was a myth which slowly stewed in the aftermath of the case, and most historians would now agree that the idea is a little hard to swallow, indeed. But whilst Kate Webster may not have been disposing of the juicier evidence in this way, she was still left with the problem of what she was going to do with the head, the foot, and the bulk of the remains in the wooden box. Throw it in the river! And by the next morning, she'd hit upon a plan of how to get rid of the body and how to make a fortune from this whole sorry mess. Okay. But she's going to steal the old lady's house or something, isn't she? She's going to forge her will or something like that. But she might need just a little help here from the person that she'd just murdered. And over the course of the next few days, it felt as if there were still two people living at 2 Mayfield cottages, even though they were both Kate Webster. Neighbours glimpsed the version of Webster who was still wearing a maid outfit and hanging out the washing as if she was just plodding on as normal, whilst tradesmen and various strangers encountered the other version who dressed in smarter clothes and answered the name of Mrs. Thomas.
Miss Hiller? Yes, dear. I take sugar in my tea. Oh, your tea! Oh, tea right there in your tea.
The version that visited Webster's old haunt in Hammersmith a couple of days after the murder to catch up with her old friends, the Porters, was a weird combination of both. Circus of Death. It had been around 6 years since the Porter family had heard a peep from their former good neighbour, and she seemed like a different woman. Now dressed, it's been 6 years and she's young, right? Now dressed in fine black silk, rocking some pretty expensive gold jewelry and clutching what appeared to be a very heavy Gladstone bag, Kate informed her old friends that she was now known as Mrs. Thomas. She revealed that since they'd last met, she'd married a man with the surname Thomas who had only gone and died, no doubt gobbled up by the very same Irish sea dragon that claimed the lives of her first sea captain husband and their 4 kids. In other news, a very rich aunt whom she'd never previously mentioned had gone and kicked the bucket as well, leaving Webster with a lovely home in Richmond that she was now looking to sell quickly, as she was planning to move back to Ireland to attend to her father, who had been taken gravely ill. This is, I know it's the past, but people still had paperwork, right? It's going to be like, wait a minute, this ain't your house. Henry and Ann Porter were genuinely pleased to catch up with their old good neighbour and spent the afternoon chatting with her in the kitchen, where they were joined later by their 15-year-old son Bob, who could barely remember this face from yesteryear. During the catch-up, Webster talked of how much of a nuisance it was having to get rid of his old aunt's house and all her valuable possessions. She asked Henry if he might know of a respectable broker who could help her shift everything. Henry initially responded that she'd surely be better off securing the services of a local broker in Richmond. Webster soon got thirsty again and decided and suggested they all pop down to the pub to get shit-faced for the rest of the evening. Ann Porter wasn't really up for it. She was beginning to feel a little under the weather, perhaps suffering from the intoxicating fumes of bullshit that had permeated the kitchen since Webster's arrival. Or that's exactly the sort of excuse I'd make. It'd be like, no, I'm just not feeling so great. Which is like, I just don't want to go to the pub and get shit faced. Just don't feel down for it right now. But Henry and Bob were bang up for it, and being the gentlemen that they were, father and son took it in turns to carry the heavy Gladstone bag all the way to the Oxford and Cambridge Arms, so as not to put much strain on Webster's delicate shoulders. After a few pleasant drinks at the pub, Webster casually grabbed the bag and announced that she had to nip out for a short while, but that she wouldn't be long. When she returned around 10 minutes later to get the next round in, the Gladstone bag mysteriously disappeared, but neither Henry nor Bob bothered to ask where it had gone. Henry and Bob get a little bit shit-oed. Whilst it's believed that the Gladstone bag had contained some of the missing limbs of Julia Thomas, it was never recovered. During the final few drinks, Webster continued to press Henry for help on recommending a broker. Whilst Henry didn't think he could help with the sale of the house, he eventually agreed to get in touch with the local publican John Church later in the week, as he felt that Church might be interested in some fancy new furnishings for his pub, The Rising Sun. As the session drew to a close, Webster asked Henry if he could borrow the services of young Bob and take him back with her to Richmond. She also claimed that she had already sold a big box of her aunt's possessions to a friend, but she might need some assistance in lugging the heavy box to the arranged meeting point at Richmond Bridge. Henry agreed to this, but only after Webster promised that she would ensure his son got back home at a reasonable time, as he had to go to work the next day. The promise was broken. Bob Porter never made it back home that night. Pause for dramatic effect and take a sharp intake of breath. Wait, why would she murder the boy? No, don't panic, he wasn't murder or anything. He just missed the last train home, so he ended up having to kip on the floor of 2 Mayfield cottages that night. Okay, good. Glad he's not been murdered. Apparently Webster made him some kippers for breakfast, and he still made it back in time for work the following morning, but it certainly had a bit of a weird night. After arriving at the house, it helped Webster carry the corded wooden box all the way to Richmond Bridge, and had made it halfway across when Webster suddenly stopped and told him that she would take it alone to the other end where a friend was waiting. Bob shrugged and walked back across the bridge, where he waited until Kate eventually returned without the box. Seconds later, he also clocked a man walking towards them across the bridge, who passed them without looking either of them in the eye. Okay, who's this dude? He didn't think much of any of this at the time, and he didn't even bother telling his dad about it when he got home. But when he was, because you went and you did exactly what you thought you were going to do. It was a bit weird, but nothing crazy. But when he was later pressed about the matter by higher authority than his own dad, he did admit that he'd heard a loud splashing noise shortly before Webster had returned, which he initially thought may have been caused by a barge traveling under the bridge. He also revealed that a slightly out-of-breath Webster had murmured the words, "Well, that's over," before they headed back to the house. Okay, don't think it's quite over, old Webster. I don't think so. The box floated around 3 miles down to Barnes Bridge before it was discovered the very next morning by the coalman Henry Wheatley, passing by on his horse and cart. Now, this all does seem to be quite a convoluted method of disposing of evidence. It appears as if Kate Webster really was trying to seize the day by squeezing in the disposal of human remains during a jolly reunion with old friends and another heavy session down the boozer. But I suppose you at least have to give her credit for trying to kill several birds with one stone during a grand day out. I don't know, it doesn't seem like clever, it just seems like dumb. It's like, how about just the one day, just get drunk in the evening and dispose of them, or get drunk in the day, or maybe actually just don't get drunk. Don't get drunk when you're disposing of a body. Don't get drunk when you're disposing of evidence. Come on. It's basic. She must have been aware that actually trying to sell 2 Mayfield cottages was always going to be a bit tricky when the real Mrs. Thomas was scattered around various bags and boxes. Webster might not even have been aware that Julia didn't own the property. She was a tenant, renting the house from a Miss Elizabeth Ives, who lived right next door. Oh no, you've made a mistake. You didn't even check the property registry? I mean, don't do that either, because that's going to make a paper trail, isn't it? How about just don't? This is a bad idea. But Webster did at least manage to source a handy new contact who might be interested in snapping up some of the valuables. And she did manage to rope in some physical assistance to help her carry the bulk of the remains to the bridge, even if it did involve catching a train to Hammersmith whilst carrying another bag of remains, which she took to somebody else's house in a pub before finally ditching it. Why would you do that? Why not just, there are things where it's worth making a separate trip. This is one of those things. What she'd done with the head was a mystery, and whilst we know that one of the feet was later found buried in a dung heap in Twickenham, in the exact opposite direction from Richmond, we don't know exactly how it got there. Well, it sounds like she made a trip for that, She should have made a trip for the other stuff. I assume she saved that task for another fun-packed day, perhaps slipping it in her coat pocket and dumping it on her way back to the beach at Southend-on-Sea. Henry Porter kept good on his word to facilitate an introduction with the publican John Church, and a deal had been struck within the next few days for Church to purchase a large selection of fine furnishing and other bits and pieces from the lady who now called herself Mrs. Thomas. Church had agreed to pay a grand total of £68 for the lot, just over £7,000 in today's money, including an upfront payment of £18 to keep Mrs. Thomas happy whilst waiting for the delivery carts to call round on the 18th of May to pick up the heavy stuff. Church had already collected a couple of valuable odds and sods that had grabbed his interest during his initial visit to the house, including a gold teeth plate, which the real Mrs. Thomas had only acquired from a dentist a couple of weeks earlier. He wasted no time in selling these on to a dealer for the sum of 6 shillings, or roughly £30 today. Guys hustling. But whilst all this wheeling and dealing was going on, some of the neighbours were already beginning to twitch their curtains in suspicion. Yeah, no shit. Like, your neighbour who lived next door now looks weird, and she's selling all of her shit for no reason. Several people had called round the property to call upon Julia for one reason or another, but all had been rather rudely turned away by the housemaid, who never appeared too forthcoming on the whereabouts of her mistress or when she might return. One such visitor was the coal agent William Dean, who regularly came round to collect payment for his services without any hassle, but on this occasion he was greeted by the housemaid, who only cracked the door to gruffly tell him that her mistress wasn't at home. As William attempted to inquire about a convenient time to call again, the maid just slammed the door in his face. Julia's brother Charles was also growing concerned about the welfare of his sister after a missed engagement, particularly after the discovery of the box of human remains and the subsequent discovery of a foot deemed to belong to the same body. These bits of body had sparked the beginnings of a frenzy which the press dubbed the Barnes Mystery, as speculation mounted as to the identity of the victim, while several individuals went out of their way to crack the case themselves by tracking down the other missing parts, with a particular emphasis on finding the head, which apparently never found, so wherever she hid the head, that's where she should have hid the rest of the stuff. This largely amounted to local treasure hunters sifting through endless piles of rubbish and excrement in a bid to get their name in the papers, but none of their efforts were to be rewarded with anything more than an infection of salmonella. The Richmond police didn't seem too convinced that the remains belonged to Julia Thomas, though, despite her brother's pleas for them to investigate further. Well, didn't the coroner say that it was someone who was much younger than her? It seems mistakenly. You can't blame them in a way. For starters, the neighbours had already revealed that Julia often went away for weeks on end without ever explaining where she'd been. Based on this behaviour, the police weren't yet ready to consider her a missing person just because she'd missed one appointment with her brother. But a brisk inquest into the death of the victim, held over the 10th to the 11th of March, had also led the police into grunting at the wrong trees. The coroner, Mr. G. Hull, had concluded that it was futile even attempting to identify a trunk and legs, which were missing a head, and an open verdict was recorded. The only real clue garnered from the inquest was the findings of a certain Dr. Adams, who wrongly concluded, there we go, that the remains belonged to a young woman between 18 and 30, and this was enough to convince the police that the victim was most definitely not 55-year-old Julia Martha Thomas. And completely fairly. It seems like, what's his face? Adams is who screwed up here, because the police would be like, well, okay, it's not her. Done. Easy. We'll trust the coroner or whatever. Who was this guy? Just some dude. Okay, a doctor, but some dude. The unidentified remains were buried in an unmarked grave in Barnes Cemetery. However, the wheels of the case began moving in the right direction again when John Church's delivery carts showed up to 2 Mayfield cottages on March the 18th. Elizabeth Ives, the landlady who lived next door, had become increasingly anxious as to the whereabouts of her tenants, and she felt deeply puzzled when she peeked out of her window to find that a load of horses and carts parked up outside 2 Mayfield cottages, and all the furniture from the house being loaded into carts. What? She'd be like, that's my furniture, this is a furnished let! What are you doing? She dashed out to grab hold of one of the delivery men and demanded to know what was going on. The befuddled bloke explained that all the goods were being delivered to John Church's pub in Hammersmith as he'd bought them from Mrs. Thomas. At that point, he pointed to the smartly dressed woman standing in the doorway who he believed to be Mrs. Thomas. This woman panicked and dashed back into the house, but not before Elizabeth Ives had caught a glimpse of her face. Be like, that's not Mrs. Thomas. Whilst Kate Webster may have been able to fool strangers into believing that she was Mrs. Thomas, she would have a harder time convincing old friends and neighbours of the victim just by dressing up in the clothes of her former mistress. It would have felt a bit like Hulk Hogan attempting to impersonate Warwick Davis by just dressing up in an Ewok costume.
Are you Hulk Hogan?
Can I please have a drink of water?
Elizabeth Ives went running to the police with her apprehensions, and she wouldn't be the only one to be troubled by the events of the day. After all the goods had been transported to the Rising Sun in Hammersmith, John Church began to feel worried about what exactly he had bought when he and his wife began to rifle through all of the items. In one of the silk dresses, they found a purse and a diary belonging to Julia Thomas, along with a very recent letter from a solicitor by the name of Mr. Menonick, which didn't seem to fit with the idea that Kate's wealthy aunt had been dead for a little while. You really made that little effort to, tidy this shit up? Come on, what's going on? Church got in touch with Henry Porter, who became equally perturbed by what might really be going on here, and the pair of them went to visit Mr. Menonick at his office. After the solicitor confirmed that as far as he knew, his client was still alive and had certainly not bequeathed a house to a niece, the trio went to the police with their findings, and it was now becoming increasingly clear that the shady behavior of certain housemaid dressing up in the clothes of a missing mistress might just have something to do with the human remains washed up in the River Thames. By the time the police sprang into action and paid a visit to 2 Mayfield cottages with the view of having a chat with Kate Webster, it was already too late. Shortly after Webster realized that Elizabeth Ives had spotted her posing as Mrs. Thomas, she knew the game was up and scarpered. Yeah, but she's got all that cash from the sale of the stuff, like the £7,000 or whatever. She's gonna, or however much it was, like £68 back in the day money. She's on the run, right? We got a lot of episode left, so it's not the end of things. According to some of the overexcitable newspaper reports at the time, the police walked into a scene that resembled the morning after a wild party held in an abattoir that had spiraled out of control. It'd be weird to have parties at abattoirs. The floors, walls, and ceilings were apparently dripping in blood, while cuts of human flesh had been left in bowls and pans, and a bloodied axe was found at the top of the stairs. But this doesn't appear to be the case at all, and there's no description of such a grisly scene in any official reports or court transcripts. Also, it doesn't make sense, right? Because the boy who helped her move the threaded bag or whatever it was, the suitcase, he slept there that night because he missed the last train home. And that was after the body had been dismembered and all of that stuff, so the blood would be all over the show. And he's just not going to notice that. He was like, it was a bit of a weird evening. But he would have been singing a different tune if everything was covered in blood and there were strips of human flesh lying about the place. On first glance, the house appeared to look reasonably clean and tidy, which would make a lot more sense, as you'd assume that a housemaid would have thought to give everything a good scrub down before inviting publicans into the home to have a good nosy at all the furnishings and goodies up for grabs. Oh, right, yeah, also the church dude went round and saw everything. Whilst John Church had expressed an interest in the furniture and the clothes and the jewellery, I think he may have passed on the option of a bloodied axe and 3 pounds of human flesh. However, a more comprehensive examination of the house did eventually reveal a few slightly more subtle bloodstains on the floor, the remains of partially burned human finger bones in the fireplace, and alarming rings of fat found behind the freshly whitewashed copper pot. A warrant was swiftly issued for the arrest of Kate Webster on suspicion of murder, but the police were hardly stretched their limits in hunting down the fugitive. In fact, they found her in pretty much the first place they looked. She's going to be in the pub, isn't she? She's going to have gone on the run to the local. To be honest, the first place I would have looked for her is the hole in the wall, but she travelled a little further than that. She'd gone to that other pub. After picking up her son John from Sarah Crease, she'd caught a train to Liverpool and hopped the next ship to Dublin, before making the final leg of the journey back to her home village of Killarn. Fortunately, she'd been thoughtful enough to leave a handy forwarding address for the police. Are you serious? Don't leave a forwarding address if you're on the run. It gives away where you're on the run to. Very little is known today, or was even known back then, of Kate Webster's roots and her early years. We have no idea what happened to her parents, but it was known that she spent a lot of time at her uncle's farm in Killarn. It may have already felt pretty obvious to both Scotland Yard and the Royal Irish Constabulary that their suspect may have fled her native Ireland to find sanctuary at the farm belonging to her only known family members, but just to hurry things along, Webster had left a recent letter from her uncle at the crime scene, which contained his full address. Sure enough, Webster and John were hiding out at the farm when the police arrived to arrest her, although it became immediately clear that she wasn't in the mood to make a full confession. Still dressed in the fine clothes and expensive jewellery taken from her victim, Webster inquired as to whether anyone else was in the frame for the murder and seemed miffed when she was told that there was not. That could soon change, though. In the meantime, Webster's primary concern was not her own fate, but that of 5-year-old John Webster. We don't know what cock-and-bull story she told her uncle, but you can be sure that she wasn't entirely honest about the reason for her sudden surprise visit. Oh, I'm on the run for murder. Good old uncle. And when the police came to the farm to arrest Webster on suspicion of murder, he wanted nothing more to do with his niece or her son. Young John was immediately packed off to a local workhouse, and unless his mother was in line for a miraculous reprieve, it looked like he'd spend the rest of his childhood in an industrial school, the Victorian-era catch-all solution for delinquents, neglected children, and kids whose parents were either dead or in prison. They were generally a pretty tough institution in which to grow up, and were designed to keep children from cluttering up the streets whilst providing them with an opportunity to learn practical hands-on skills such as carpentry and shoemaking for boys and sewing and knitting for girls. Webster felt that her only hope of saving her boy from a life of grueling hardship and saving herself from the hangman's noose was to try and pin the blame on somebody else. And so that's exactly what she did. Get a lawyer, talk to a lawyer. Lawyers should be helpful here. Shortly afterwards, she was taken back to London to face a formal charge of murder. John Church was called into the police station to identify the woman he still only knew as Mrs. Thomas, with whom he had recently conducted business. Before he even had a chance to speak and confirm her identity, Webster pointed a finger at the publican and angrily yelled to the police, "Here's your murderer." John Church swiftly became the second person to be arrested and charged with the murder of Julia Martha Thomas. The sound of the crowd. Almost as swiftly as he was arrested and charged, John Church was released again. Yes, be like, oh wait, I mean, we arrested him just to be sure, but it's obviously not him. For John. It was reported by some quarters of the contemporary press that he had been able to provide a cast iron alibi to prove his whereabouts on the day of the murder, but that seems a little unlikely, as the exact date of the murder wouldn't even have been known for sure at this time. Wow, there's a lot of unreliable reporting around this, isn't there, Danny? It seems more credible that it was more a simple case of common sense. If John Church had been involved in any way with a devious murder plot, he would hardly have gone running to the police with his misgivings at the first possible opportunity, and he would hardly have voluntarily surrendered to the police every single item of the bundle for which he'd just paid today's equivalent of $7,000, as well as providing all details on where he had already sold some of the other items that he picked up earlier. As Kate Webster awaited trial in Newgate Prison, it seems as if the press and public had already made up their minds about her guilt. During the earlier police-escorted train journey from Ireland to England, crowds had gathered at every stopping point along the way to shout and jeer and roar their anger in the direction of the prisoner. The story had evolved into something of a macabre sensation in both England and Ireland, and pages of the newspapers often went into grisly details about every detailed element of the crime, even if many of those details were pure speculation. Yes, the press of the past is like, we don't know, or it's not interesting enough. Just make it up a little bit. Perfect. The blatant, widespread revulsion expressed toward the subject may have been exacerbated by a number of different factors. For starters, she was a woman, and a housemaid at that. Back in the Victorian era, women were only responsible for between 10 and 15% of murders and were far more likely to be murder victims. A shocking story like this, in which a subservient maid dared to turn against her own wealthy and respectable mistress in the ultimate act of betrayal, was enough to get everyone around the breakfast table choking on their porridge in disgust. I mean, murdering your mistress, chopping her to bits and boiling up her remains, it's just not very ladylike, is it? Well, apparently she wasn't very ladylike, was she? Kate Webster's physical appearance and perceived lack of femininity also attracted some pretty savage verdicts at the time, with the Illustrated Police News describing her as gaunt, repellent, and trampish-looking, while the author Elliot O'Donnell later described her as not merely savage and shocking, but the grimmest of grim personalities, a character so uniquely sinister and barbaric as to be hardly human. Holy shit, Elliot. He's throwing that shade, as the kids would say. Webster's Irish roots only serve to fuel the English assumption that she must surely be guilty, with one of the more sympathetic assessments coming from English author Arthur Morrison, who observed Webster was of course Irish, which may go some way to explain her bestial behavior. Shit, dude. What? And yet, to be fair, I have myself met and talked to many an Irish. I've met many an Irish. And most often found them to be decent Christians, though obviously one cannot trust a single word they say. I mean, obviously, they're Irish! Oh my god, what was this guy's name? Morrison? Holy shit, Arthur. Yeah, that really was the best that England could muster at the time in finding a kind word to say about the Irish. They were decent Christians, but obviously everything they say is a lie. Obviously.
Down with this sort of thing. Careful now. Down with this sort of thing.
Madame Tussauds was also convinced of Webster's guilt to the extent that they created a waxwork model of the suspect and proudly planted it at the Chamber of Horrors section long before she even stood trial. The original version of the Chamber of Horrors was home to wax effigies of some of the most notorious perpetrators of disturbing crimes in history, including some familiar names that have popped up on this very channel, such as Dr. Crippen, whom I can just about remember covering in the very first Casual Criminalist video back in early 2021. Casual Criminalist coming up on 4 years. Holy shit. There you go. So guilty or not, Kate Webster would find herself in some quite distinguished company. I remember going to the Chamber of Horrors was really scary. It's one of my early memories. Like I just remember there was someone having their head chopped off. There was someone having their a blade taken to their scalp. Oh, holy shit. This isn't appropriate for children. But it does seem like a bit of a gamble to commission a new waxwork model before the subject had even got a chance to defend herself. I suppose Madame Tussauds may have had a backup plan if the verdict was to go the other way. Then they could put the model in storage for about 120 years, then tweak it slightly to make a new waxwork of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Webster also found herself to be the leading character in a number of popular street ballads that were being recited up and down the country, some of which were published for public consumption, including a ballad that went by the cheerful name of Murder and Mutilation of an Old Lady Near Barnes. People had weird titles in the past. They were so descriptive. Not sure if that would have made it onto Top of the Pops in the 1970s, although maybe it's not that hard to imagine Jimmy Savile introducing it shortly before the grand climax with Gary Glitter. The Victorian era had nothing on the 1970s. But Kate Webster probably wasn't whistling along to street ballads as she languished in Newgate prison awaiting trial. Things moved refreshingly quickly in those days. Refreshingly quickly. I sentenced you to death. Now go outside and we'll chop your head off right away. Wow, the justice system, it moves so quickly. So impressive. So she only had to wait until July the 2nd, 1879, before she faced the Honourable Mr. Justice Denman at the Old Bailey Courthouse. The case lasted 6 days and the suspect pled not guilty to a single charge of willful murder. She certainly put up a lively defence. Webster still maintained that Mr. John Church was the murderer and the ringleader of a scheme which also involved her old neighbour Henry Porter. She claimed that Church and herself had been involved in a long-running illicit affair and that he promised to ultimately leave his wife and pub to run away to America with Webster. But first he needed to raise some money, and it was Church who apparently first came up with the idea of getting rid of Julia Thomas and flogging everything she owned. During her incredibly long-winded and detailed testimony, Webster recounted a night on which Church had visited her at 2 Mayfield cottages under the pretense of her being her long-lost brother, so as to not arouse the disapproving wrath of Julia Thomas, who would likely have complained about her home being turned into a knocking shop. According to Webster, quote, "During conversation, I had told him the mistress had no money in the house. He said, 'Couldn't we put the old woman out of the way?' I said, 'What do you mean?' And he said, 'Oh, poison her.' I said, 'You must do that yourself. I'll have nothing to do with that.'" A few days later, Webster claimed that she had returned home from a visit with her son to find John Church holding a carving knife and standing over the dying body of Julia Thomas. She told the court, quote, "I saw Mrs. Thomas lying on the mats in the passage, struggling and groaning. Church catched me by the arm, pulled me in, and closed the door. I said, 'Whatever have you done?' He said, 'Never you mind. I have done it for her, and if you say a word about it, I'll put this knife into you up to the bundle.'" She then claimed the Church had later forced her to collect a corded wooden box from his pub and meet with him at Richmond Bridge, a task for which Webster had roped in young Bob Porter to assist with the heavy lifting. Church had insisted that Bob stay at the other end of the bridge so that the boy would not see him lob the box into the water. Webster claimed that at this point she still wasn't sure what exactly was in the box, although she was beginning to brew a few hunches. I wonder what's in the box.
Put the gun down.
I saw you with the box. What was in the box?
Because I envy your normal life.
Put the gun down, David.
It seems that envy is my sin.
Oh, what's in the box?
Afterwards, John Church was said to have involved his old friend Henry Porter in helping out with stripping the victim's house bare and sourcing buyers for the goods, whilst Webster travelled back to Ireland in distress after effectively losing her home and her job and any prospects of a new life in America. I mean, this doesn't have to be a likely story for John Church to have done this. It just has to be likely enough that she establishes reasonable doubt, right? I guess that's how things worked this far back in the past as well. So while it is ridiculous, all she needs is for it to be a little bit not ridiculous. Like, maybe it could be a maybe. In conclusion, Webster declared to the court, "I never laid a hand on Mrs. Thomas. I had nothing to do with murdering her. But I knew Church had done it. I don't see why I should be blamed for what Church has done. I wouldn't accuse my greatest enemy of anything wrong, let alone a friend, which Church has been to me up till now." Well, yeah, you can be his friend until you need him to get off the hook for murder. All this might make you wonder if there could possibly be a grain of truth in Webster's version of events, and that she was either a horrified bystander to a murder of which she wanted no part, or that at the very least she had at least one accomplice in this plot who was now trying to shift all the blame onto her. I was initially quite intrigued by the segment of 15-year-old Bob Porter's testimony, which he described the events that took place on Richmond Bridge. He reckons that after Webster had rejoined him at the end of the bridge without the box, a gentleman had emerged from the other end and walked straight past them without looking them in the eye. I mean, but this would have had to have been his dad. He's not going to recognize his dad? Could this have been John Church, the real murderer, who had just disposed of the evidence that Webster has handed over? I did think about that, the dude who didn't look at them. But even if he doesn't look at you, you're going to be like, oh, hey, Dad, what up? No, I don't think so. We have to remember that Richmond Bridge is freely accessible to the public, and whilst it was late at night, it's not unreasonable to assume that other people might have been crossing the bridge without feeling the need to make eye contact with everyone they passed. Besides, John Church was a friend of Bob's dad, and so, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, no, right, John Church isn't his dad. The son's, the young lad's father is, the dad, and then Church is a friend. So they would know each other, and so he would have recognized him. And if Bob was in on the conspiracy, he probably would have avoided any mention of another presence on the bridge. Both John Church and Henry Porter were respectable men who had never displayed any criminal tendencies in the past, in sharp contrast to Kate Webster, who had spent more time inside prison than out during the last 10 years. Her entire story was blown apart by the prosecution, who called over 40 witnesses, including Church, the Porter family, and neighbors of the victim, who were all able to illustrate the holes in Webster's plot. Landlady Elizabeth Ives was the only witness to have heard any kind of noise on the night that Julia Thomas was believed to have taken a tumble down the stairs, although the only noise she heard sounded like a chair falling onto the floor, and she didn't pay much attention at the time. A much longer list of neighbors described the nauseating stench that was emanating from 2 Mayfield cottages by the following morning, and several witnesses testified to catching regular glimpses of Kate Webster alone in the house, acting very erratically and slamming the door in people's faces long after the victim had disappeared. Whilst her version of the story indicated that she sailed to Ireland in distress almost immediately after the murder, it was obvious that she'd stayed on alone at the house for quite some time, tending to business. Before the removal carts arrived, John had only been spotted near the property once, and that was presumably on the single occasion when he turned up to the house and struck the original deal for £68. Speaking of which, he paid Kate Webster in full for the merchandise, which doesn't really tie in with the idea of him orchestrating a dastardly fundraising scheme. If he'd done the deed himself, he would have had no reason to pay the equivalent of $7,000 to the housemaid and alleged illicit lover. Another discrepancy is that Webster had suggested that the Cordon wooden box belonged to John Church and that she picked it up from his pub, whereas several witnesses in court testified that the box was most definitely the property of the victim that must have been taken from the house. It's just the worst thought-through crime ever. Oh, you're breaking all the rules! An interesting new angle to the story was provided by the testimony of a bonnet maker by the name of Mary Durden, who was a former friend of Webster's. Mary testified that during their last meeting, which took place 5 days before the murder, Webster had explained that she would soon be going away to Birmingham to sell property and valuables recently bequeathed to her by a wealthy aunt. The descriptions of the valuables exactly matched the items from the home of Julia Thomas, which were eventually sold to John Church. This would seem to suggest that for the first time, that the murder was very much premeditated rather than the outcome of a spontaneous quarrel, and may explain why neighbor Elizabeth Ives didn't hear much of a commotion from next door on the night of the murder. I mean, it's not hard to put 2 and 2 together, though, is it, guys? It's like, she's interested in money, she's got a history of thievery, she killed her and now she's selling all the stuff? It's like, come on, it's not premeditated. We know she planned this. Oh, she's going to be hung. She's going to get hanged? What's the correct phrase there? I think it's to be hanged, right? She had often heard the mistress and housemaid arguing loudly in the past, but on that night, she just heard a loud thump, possibly suggesting that there was no quarrel at all and that Webster had been silently waiting at the top of the stairs for her victim to return from the church service. Yeah, it's like if you hear there's an argument going on, then you hear a dunk. It's like, oh wow, I guess they just stopped arguing and had a big hug. It's like, no. Someone's unconscious. I do find it a bit weird that the Porter family weren't just a little suspicious about their old neighbor's strange behavior when she turned up on their doorstep after an absence of 6 years carrying a Gladstone bag, which then went missing during a pub session. And you'd have thought that Bob may have asked a few more questions about why he was helping to carry a heavy wooden box to a bridge to give to a man who wasn't even there. I mean, yeah, but she was like, I'm going to go over the bridge and give it to him, so you don't have to see him, or whatever her excuse was. I mean, it's a weak excuse, but if you don't suspect anything, you're not expecting excuses to be fed to you, are you? So you're kind of just like, oh, it's nothing. She's an old friend. She's a friend of my dad's friend or something like that. What was it? That's not to assume any guilt on their part, though. Perhaps they just weren't the inquisitive type, or perhaps they figured that their old neighbor was more likely up to something a bit dodgy involving stolen goods, but had no idea that it involved the boiled human remains of a murder victim. Yeah, that's another fair one. I think maybe they just didn't care. And then secondly, they're like, oh, she's up to something dodgy. I'm just not going to ask, so I can't tell. You know, it's like, what, don't ask, don't tell? I know it's a different thing, but it is kind of like, yeah, I mean, if you don't ask, you don't have any knowledge of it, do you? Is that an excuse? I know not knowing something is a crime, is non-excuse, right? Although that doesn't make sense, because you have to have like the thought part of the crime as well, right? Oh my god, it's been too long since I studied this. But if you don't make an effort to find out, I don't feel like that's on you. Otherwise, we'd all have to be interrogating our friends all the time in case they're doing crimes. Whilst Kate had a long history of pickpocketing and theft, she had never previously given any hint that she might be capable of murder. But the story painted to the jury by the witnesses was a case of both John Church and the Porter family being misled into making a deal with a murderess who had then concocted a long and elaborate story in court, many parts of which were proven to be false. No witnesses at all were called to the stand to defend Kate Webster or to corroborate her story, and very few people had anything nice to say about the defendant. There were a few notable exceptions, including her old friend and child carer Sarah Crease and Sarah's employer Lucy Loader, who had first recommended the services of Kate Webster to the woman who would go on to be her victim. Miss Loader felt that Webster was, quote, a very obliging girl and did her work well, and Sarah Crease was happy to tell the court, quote, she has always been a kind-hearted, good sort of girl, as far as I know, and affectionate and grateful for kindness done to her. My husband had an illness for 4 months, during which she nursed him and waited on him all day, and did all she could for him. She was fond of me and fond of the child. I never heard her say or do anything unkind to anybody. She told me that Mrs. Thomas was a very nice lady, very good and kind-hearted. She appeared very fond of her as a mistress. Yeah, you've been fed a bag of lies, haven't you? A couple of members of the Porter family, Bob and his mother Anne, also chipped in with comments which suggested that the defendant had always shown kindness to them when they were neighbours, which was a surprisingly decent thing for them to do, considering that their kind former neighbour had just tried to implicate that Henry Porter had a hand in helping to shift stolen goods. He wasn't helping, he was just willfully ignorant, I think is the phrase. Yeah, what's nothing wrong with a bit of willful ignorance, is there, Porter? But I can't help feeling that Kate Webster's barrister, Warner Slay, great name. His name is Warner Slay. Shit. Could have tried. I don't know why that's so great, but it is. Could have tried. It's not Slay, S-L-A-Y, although it should be. It's Slay like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Could have tried a little bit harder with the defense, or at least tried harder to get his client to just shut up for a minute. Whilst the press and the public were already convinced of her guilt, the prosecution, led by Sir Hardinge Gifford, should actually have been quite a tricky challenge. The remains of the body were never identified, as this was impossible at the time without the missing head. There's a good reason why they never made a series of CSI Victorian London. That'd be fucking awesome. That is a cracking idea for a skit, Daddy, where it's like, and it's like Victorian London, and there's like Horatio Kane, and he's like, all right, get this back to the lab. And someone's like, you what, sir? Get him back to the where? We just have to keep an eye out. Obviously, if it was written by an actual comedian, it would be a lot better. So just imagine that it's actually funny.
Detective, we found a pool of the killer's blood in that hallway. And he would just be like, gross. Mop it up. Now then, back to my hunch.
Assistant Surgeon Thomas Bond testified in court that he completely disagreed with the findings of associate Dr. Adams during the original inquest and reckoned that the human remains were likely to belong to a short woman of over 50 years of age. But this still wasn't proof that the victim was definitely Julia Thomas, nor was it proof that Julia Thomas was even dead. She might even have been away on one of her mysterious trips, which she never talked about, although, in fairness, they didn't just usually last for the best part of 5 months. Whilst there was certainly evidence to suggest that Webster had been acting in a very shady manner after the victim's disappearance and appeared to be selling valuables that didn't belong to her, there was no hard evidence that she had murdered the victim beforehand. Yeah, this is one of those cases where it's like, no, I was just doing a little bit of thievery. I wouldn't murder anyone. I was just shifting stolen merchandise. I mean, don't normally admit to lesser crimes to get off on bigger crimes, but in this case, if your lawyer tells you to, or your barrister, because we're talking about England, not bad. There had been no witness to the murder, and all the prosecution really had to go on were reports of a nauseating stench, the odd behaviour involving a Gladstone bag, which was never even recovered, and the word of a 15-year-old boy regarding the last sighting of the wooden box, which later washed up by the River Thames. Webster could feasibly have feigned complete ignorance as to the true fate of Julia Thomas and made out that she was just taking criminal advantage of what may have been a temporary disappearance of her mistress. It's not bad. It's not a bad defense, because remember, all you got to do is establish reasonable doubt. It can be really, really likely that she did it. Like, you can be really, really quite reasonably sure. I realize if I say quite sure, that means something different in American. Like, Americans say quite sure means really sure. In UK English, quite sure means you're like, maybe. Because I'll send something to an American, they'll be like, what do you think of this? They'll be like, it's quite good. And I'll be like, oh no, it needs fixing. Whereas they really mean, it's really good. And I'm like, okay. It took me too long to realize that. And I was like, wow, Americans are harsh critics, but they're just saying it's good. But it's all about that reasonable doubt, isn't it? She would have still faced time in prison for this, but she would have been less likely to face the hangman's noose on a charge of murder. The defense tried to play heavily on the idea that the remains may not have been those of Julia Thomas, but they were largely pissing in the wind, as Webster had come up with a story which confirmed that Julia Thomas was dead and contained elements which tied in neatly with the evidence of the prosecution. She had effectively scored a massive own goal. And whilst the jury were inclined to dismiss her version of events in which John Church was the murderer, they were inclined to believe the broader picture that Webster knew very well what had happened to the victim and how the remains had ended up in the River Thames. Perhaps the defense barrister, Warner Slay, had given up altogether during his quite bizarre closing statement in which he proposed that even if the discovered remains did belong to Julia Thomas, she may have died from perfectly natural causes. Yeah, she died from natural causes. Then someone cut her head off, her foot off, boiled her remains in a giant pot, threw some in the Thames, hid the head somewhere unfindable, and buried the foot in, like, Wembley or something? Natural causes, huh? Yes, she died of tuberculosis, then was boiled. Right. An idea which is a bit hard to take seriously when the head and one foot are missing and the rest of the body has been boiled. Exactly, Danny. It took the jury around 75 minutes of deliberation before they returned to the courtroom with a verdict that found Kate Webster guilty of willful murder. Good, because I really think she did this. Would I be beyond reasonable doubt certain? Yeah, I think I would be. Sending her to the noose, though? I feel like that's a higher burden somehow, even though I know it shouldn't be, because you're not responsible for the sentencing in a death penalty, right? It's the judge who's going to decide the sentence. How did it work in the 19th century? I don't even know. When Mr. Justice Denman asked Webster if she could think of any reason why she should not be given the death penalty, she initially came out with a rambling monologue which protested her innocence and tried to blame the father of her child, the mysterious Mr. Strong, for leading her into a life of wicked thievery after he walked out on them. But then she came up with one final tactic to escape the noose. She decided to plead the belly and claim that she was pregnant. Oh, wait, you can get away. This is the Elizabeth Holmes things. You can't send me to prison. I'm pregnant. And then they're like, bang, 12 years. She got 12 years, 25 years, 12 years. The other guy, the crypto dude, he got like 25. She got 12. She was trying not to go to prison because she was pregnant, or I don't know. Let's see how it goes. Kate Webster wouldn't have been the first woman of the Victorian era to claim that they were pregnant shortly after being sentenced to death. The state couldn't execute a pregnant woman, as this would have been seen as murdering the unborn child, so she would instead be sent to prison until the arrival of the bouncing bundle of joy, by which time the death sentence might have just been commuted with a bit of luck. Okay, I mean, not a bad strategy. In some cases, the prisoner would try to get pregnant immediately after the death sentence, which must have been quite challenging when they were behind bars or waiting their fate, but I gather they might occasionally be allowed male visitors, or some of them might have got a bit flirty with the guards. Oh my god, that is crazy. It wasn't just strictly a case of being pregnant, though. This prisoner specifically had to be quick with child. Alright, which essentially meant that the baby should be felt moving in the womb, as it was believed that this was the point at which the fetus became a living soul. Okay then. But who exactly assessed whether the prisoner was quick with child? Well, quite incredibly, it was usually not a medical professional, but a hastily selected jury of any 12 married mothers who just happened to be in the courtroom. What is going on, 19th century laws? This is crazy. If there weren't enough married mothers in the courtroom of that day, somebody would have to go out and drag them in from the street. There's a dude with a bell. Hear ye, hear ye! Round up, mothers! You better be married! It hardly gives you complete faith in the accuracy of the process, and it's believed that some mothers who were quick with child were executed anyway, whilst others got a reprieve, even though they weren't pregnant at all. I don't know, if I was that, I'd just be like, okay, I'm going to eat some real spicy lunch, and then be like, oh, yeah, it's moving around down there. That's my child. The whole concept of pleading the belly was finally abolished from English common law in 1931 when methods of testing pregnancy had become a bit more reliable, if still not yet entirely precise, and any pregnant woman facing the death penalty would automatically get their sentence commuted to life imprisonment with hard labor. Woo, okay, get out of jail free card, except not get out of jail because you got to do a life of hard labor, which sounds miserable, but I don't know. I quite like hard labor. I like working hard. I think if I was like on those chain gangs, people would be like, just do the least possible. I'd be like, dude, I'm gonna break this road right up. I'm gonna break all of these rocks because I'm weird. Just like it. We still hear tales from around the world of female death row inmates regaming the system, though. As recently as 2016, a 42-year-old Vietnam prisoner named Nguyen Thi Hu was sentenced to death for drug trafficking, but managed to duck out of range of the firing squad by getting pregnant after somehow managing to obtain multiple bags of sperm and a few syringes from a helpful male inmate. Dude, I'd like to think they called the baby Phoenix. That's just like turkey basting it up. That's so grim. When Kate Webster pleaded the belly, there were indeed 12 married mothers already inside the courtroom, which saved a bit of time, and they had a helping hand from a medical professional in the shape of Assistant Surgeon Thomas Bond, who had earlier indicated that the doctor at the original inquest had been talking out of his bottom. The jury of matrons retired to a private room with the prisoner for a grand total of 3 minutes before returning to the courtroom and declaring that Webster was not quick with child. Her last-minute claim of pregnancy is often described as Kate Webster's final lie, and realistically it probably was, but it's important to remember that whilst she was not deemed to be quick with child, it wasn't conclusively ruled out that she was pregnant. As there were no more rabbits to pull out of the hat, Mr. Justice Denman shoved his fetching black cap on and sentenced Kate Webster to death. An appeal was launched on her behalf, and she spent the final 4 weeks in Wandsworth Prison without receiving a single visitor. I suspect she'd blown any chance of another jolly catch-up with the Porter family. Yeah, maybe. The appeal was dismissed by the Home Secretary, R.A. Cross, on the grounds that he had failed to discover any sufficient ground to justify giving Her Majesty to interfere with the due course of law. Webster's final public statement from the prison was printed on full-page spreads in most of the newspapers, and it appears that she had taken the opportunity to completely exonerate John Church and Henry Porter from any blame. She wrote, "I am now informed by my solicitor that the memorial presented on my behalf has not been successful, and I will be executed at 9 o'clock on Tuesday the 29th. They really got on with it in the past, didn't they? It's like, yeah, you're going to be executed. Nowadays, it'd be like, okay, I mean, that's going to happen in like a decade. And in the past, they're just like, go on then, 4 weeks, you got 4 weeks. And if the Home Secretary says no, off with your head, or rope around your neck, or whatever they're up to. I see that there is no visible hope for a respite of my sentence, and I am advised by him, and I feel that I am bound in the sight of Almighty God to clear everyone of suspicion, and especially those whose names I mentioned in my previous statements before I die, which I am now happy in doing." End quote. Just 1 day before the sentence was due to be carried out, Webster made a final confession to the Catholic priest Father McHenry in the presence of her solicitor and a prison warden. She ran through the details of the murder and explained how she became engaged in a fiery argument with her mistress, which had led to Webster shoving Julia down the stairs. She then admitted that she panicked and choked her victim to death, after which she chopped the body to bits and boiled most of the remains in the copper pot. I feel like you could have escaped the death penalty if you'd gone with, I shoved her down the stairs and she died after an argument. And then I panicked and disposed of her body. I feel like that would take it from like, what do you call it? Like murder 1 to murder 2 or whatever. I was reading this morning that kid who shot that healthcare CEO in the middle of New York, which is insane. He's been charged with like murder 2 or whatever rather than murder 1. And I'm like, wait, what's murder 2? It seems pretty fucking premeditated. So this should quash any lingering doubts about Webster's guilt, right? Well, maybe. There's still much debate today over just how many of these so-called final confessions from the Victorian era were genuine and how many were manipulated on some level by the authorities who were keen to justify the execution of a prisoner still pleading their innocence. It's not as if Kate Webster would have any control over what got quoted in the newspapers. The thing that bothers me about the final public statement and the final confession is that there's no mention of what she did with the missing head or the missing Gladstone bag, aside from a pretty vague line which reads, "I determined to do away with the body as best I could." If Webster really had reached a point where she was ready to accept total responsibility in the sight of Almighty God, you'd have thought that she might have at least pointed the police in the right direction of the missing head so that the remains could finally be officially identified. Could it be that the real author of these statements was not able to provide that information as they didn't have the slightest clue? Food for thought, isn't it? I'll take the bread, but I'll pass on the dripping. It's a bit suspicious, isn't it? It does feel like one of those Victorian that Danny's just told me exist. I didn't know about that before, like false confessions by, to tie up all the loose ends nicely. But that missing head is weird. Like, where's the head at? 29-year-old Kate Webster was hanged on July the 29th, 1879, in a building nicknamed the Cold Meat Shed, just across the yard from Wandsworth Prison. The Cold Meat Shed sounds like a hipster deli. Public executions had been abolished around a decade earlier, but a crowd of revelers had rather pointlessly gathered outside the prison walls, even though they couldn't see a thing. Well, this happens today, doesn't it? You get people who are being executed in, like, Texas or whatever, and there'll be people outside the prison, some of them being like, down with the death penalty, and other people like, kill him, make him suffer. The state hangman, William Marwood, had only recently developed his long drop technique, which was considered to be more humane as it broke the neck instantly, instead of leaving the prisoner to die slowly of asphyxia while dangling on the rope. Question: is dying of asphyxia that bad? Like, is it that bad to just, like, have the blood cut off to your brain? I feel like if someone was like, we're just going to tie this rope around your neck and, then you're going to pass out. Or would you rather, like, be dropped from a height and have your neck snap? I'll be like, I'm going to go for the choking thing, I think. I think I'd rather be strangled to death. Is that, like, not where you'd, like, breaking it, but just, like, tight enough to cut off the blood to the brain? That seems like a better way to go. God, this is a grim thought. Rather than being like, right? Maybe just me. I'd be like, no, I don't want the humane long drop. Hang me the old-fashioned way. When the black flag was raised on a pole above the prison walls to confirm that Marwood had clocked off for the day, the assembled crowd gave a loud cheer before drifting back home and wondering if they could have found a better way to spend the morning. The Richmond murderess was buried under the name of Catherine Webster and laid to rest in an unmarked grave near one of Wandsworth's prison exercise yards. Wait, how's she buried under the name of Catherine Webster but in an unmarked grave? I don't understand. Madame Tussauds had clearly backed the right horse, and the waxwork exhibit remained on display in the Chamber of Horrors for 80 years. You can still see a version of the Chamber of Horrors today after it reopened in 2022, but it's far more family-friendly and less sensationalized today, largely focusing on criminology and forensics, so there's no room for Kate Webster or Dr. Crippen. I get the feeling that that's a change post my childhood, because I remember it being weird and scary, although maybe I was just a child. John Church didn't do too badly from the outcome of the trial, as he was allowed to keep all the items he'd purchased from 2 Mayfield cottages, whilst an auction held shortly after the execution cleaned out all the remaining possessions still left in the property, including the knife which Webster had dismembered the body with and the copper pot in which the remains were boiled. That is so grim. Those should be just taken to that big police warehouse that you see in the movies, kept there for, like, I don't know, 10 years or however long. Probably longer than 10 years, right? How long do they keep crime stuff for? Even for sold crimes. I don't know, probably keep it for a while. And then eventually just throw it away. Don't have this kind of weird, macabre evidence out there in the world. It's just weird. It's like Nazi crockery and stuff. How about we just destroy all that shit, rather than, like, having weird collectors? It's like, oh, no, I'm not a Nazi. I just love collecting Nazi paraphernalia.
This is Hitler's cup. That was Hitler's cup. Yeah.
It's like, all right, dude. It's a bit weird though, isn't it? The house itself would remain unoccupied for nearly 20 years and would eventually be demolished in the very early 20th century. Oh, well, there's why we couldn't find it. Whilst it was deemed perfectly reasonable to snap up a few blood-stained murder souvenirs at auction for a few shillings each, the idea of actually living in the house was clearly a step too far. As I've always said, I'd take it. Like, if that house is like 20% below market, I'll be like, yeah, I'll take it. We'll strip out all the inside. No one will ever know there was a murder there. No one will ever know that old lady was boiled in the kitchen in a giant pot. Okay, maybe it's a bit grim to live there, but 20% is a lot off, Spare a thought for poor 5-year-old John Webster, though. His exact fate is unknown. I would have hoped that Sarah Creese may have made some kind of intervention here, considering how much time she'd already spent caring for the child, but there are no records of this, and I suppose there may have been natural reservations about bringing up the child of the notorious Richmond murderess. I don't know. I think, like, sins of the father and all that, not sins of the mother in this case, I think people wouldn't judge that. I think people would be like, good for you. People are weird, though. People are weird. It's deemed more likely that he was indeed destined to live out the rest of his childhood at an industrial school for the misbehaved and neglected, and, as is his case, the offspring of the executed. There was one final ballad to hit the streets after the execution, which was again widely printed onto pamphlets, this one apparently meant to be sung to the tune of the 19th century ballad Driven from Home, which I realise is no help to Simon whatsoever. Is that a 19th century ballad? Is that help to anyone who's listening? But if it's any help, I think it works equally well to the tune of I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor. Wait, is that the I Will Survive as long as I have I want to say Weetabix, because that was an advert when I was a kid. As long as I have Weetabix, I know I will survive.
Now go, they'll learn to drive. As long as I've had Weetabix, I might just stay alive.
I'm not going to sing it. Whoever's editing this, if you want to plug it into one of those AI things and have it make a song, go for it. The terrible crime at Richmond at last on Kate Webster now has been cast. Tried and found guilty, she sentenced to die. From the strong hand of justice, she cannot fly. She has tried all excuses, but of no avail about this murder, and she's told many tales. She has tried to throw blame on others as well, but with all her cunning, at last, she has fell. In a very recent twist, though, there was to be another verse tacked on to the end of the Ballad of Kate Webster over 130 years later in 2010, thanks to a completely accidental discovery made by Sir David Attenborough. Oh, I completely forgot about this. Is he going to find the head? He's like, well, I was just in my basement and there was a head down there. The best kept secret. You might know Sir David Attenborough as the celebrated naturalist, broadcaster, environmental advocate, national treasure, and the bloke who likes to cuddle gorillas. Some of you might know him as the younger brother of Richard. I know him as the 1960s BBC Do Controller who played a significant role in introducing colour television to the UK for the first time. That was obviously way before my time, but this directly led to Sir David introducing snooker to television for the first time, which is the only sport I follow. Danny follows snooker? I've complained about snooker before, how when I was a kid. It'd be like, yeah, Star Trek The Next Generation has been postponed this week for the snooker. And I'll just be like, no, people knocking those Red Balls around. I just want to see Jean-Luc Picard go on adventures.
Take it so, number one.
It would have been very much fun to watch in black and white. If you lived in the Richmond area of London, you might know him as Dave, the guy who owns one of the nice houses situated between what used to be the residence of Julia Thomas and the hole-in-the-wall pub. Wait, that's where he lives? I don't like it when we know where celebrities live. It feels weird. So David first bought the property with his wife Jane back in 1952. Although it's unlikely to have ever been their primary address, I'm sure they still enjoyed a few pints in the hole in the wall from time to time. Sadly, that would have come to an end in 2007 when the pub called Last Orders for the final time and fell into dereliction. So David eventually decided to snap up the whole pub in 2009. Some rich people buying a pub you like. I like that. Although this was not because he suddenly fancied having a go at pulling pints, he wanted to redevelop the land and transform it into an orchard and garden, which would serve as an extension to his existing property next door. So far, so good. Fair play. That's another rich person shit, where you buy your neighbor's house just to demolish it so you can have a larger garden. Yes, especially if you're doing that shit in Richmond. But then, on December the 22nd, 2010, workmen who were toiling away on the excavation of the land dug up something near the pub's former stables, which they really didn't expect to find: a human skull. Could this have been the missing head of Julia Martha Thomas? It absolutely could be. If they can find that unmarked grave, they can dig up her bones, crack them open, extract some of that DNA, extract some of the DNA from the skull, and see if it is her. I wonder if they have any other... Maybe those police warehouses, maybe they still got some of like her hairbrush or whatever. Get that DNA analysis going. Carbon dating conducted at the University of Edinburgh concluded that the skull was dated from somewhere between 1650 to 1880, which I know is a little vague, but the fact that it had been found on a layer of Victorian tiles also suggests that it belonged to the very back end of this estimate. Yeah, it's cool, like... Archaeology's really cool. Further testing revealed that the skull belonged to a woman of roughly menopausal age and showed fracture marks consistent with a fall down the stairs, along with low collagen levels, consistent with it being boiled. West London coroner Alison Thompson later concluded in 2011 that she had found clear, convincing and compelling evidence that the skull belonged to Julia Martha Thomas and that the victim had died from asphyxiation and blows to the head. And this grim discovery does beg the question, where was Sir David Attenborough the night of March the 2nd, 1879? No, David Attenborough is an old dude. Siri, how old's David Attenborough? Oh, Siri has stopped talking to me. He's just stopped talking to me. My phone literally doesn't, I think just abused Siri so much. Now it just does nothing. I got this new iPhone and Siri just doesn't work. Nah, I'm only pulling a dismembered leg. So David was as surprised as anyone else to find a human skull buried on his land, although he later admitted that he had no prior knowledge of the murder case at all, and so the whole case was an intriguing revelation for him. He should definitely make a documentary about it, though. in color. Sadly, the head could not be laid to rest with the rest of the remains of Julia Thomas, as there's no record of where exactly they were buried in the unmarked grave in Barnes Cemetery, in contrast to the known burial spot of her murderer at Wandsworth Prison. But Detective Inspector Dave Bolton appeared to be particularly excited by this latest development, as he told the press, quote, "This is a good example of how good old-fashioned detective work, historical records, and technological advances came together to solve the Barnes mystery. I mean, sort of, but it's also not fully solved." Is it? I initially thought that this was a strange thing to say, and I'm reminded that this came from the same bloke who appeared to believe the stories of Kate Webster passing off human fat as pig lard. If the Barnes mystery had never been solved until 2011, then why had a woman been sentenced to death for it over 130 years earlier? Oh God. Besides, the recent discovery was less about good old-fashioned detective work and more about Sir David developing a hankering for a new extension to his house. But I think I know where Dave Bolton is coming from. Until 2011, the ruling of an open verdict still stood from the original inquest into the officially unidentified remains. After 132 years, this verdict was finally updated to confirm that the remains belonged to murder victim Julia Martha Thomas, who died from asphyxiation and a head injury. It also perhaps sheds fresh light on the real reason for Kate Webster's sudden decision to visit the pub after carrying out the murder and dismembering the body. I'd originally assumed that she just felt the need to get away from the stench for a while and take a quick break from the macabre kitchen duties. But she may well have been hiding the first piece of evidence near the stables of the hole in the wall on the very same night that the victim was killed. But we may never know the exact reasons why she carried out the murder in the first place. If we're to believe her supposed confession, then it was the spontaneous result of an argument that boiled over into rage and panic and desperate measures. Yeah, but the neighbor always heard them arguing, and then he didn't hear them arguing, or she didn't hear them arguing on that night. So it's a bit weird, isn't it? Yes, if we're to believe the testimony from our old friend and bodymaker Mary Durden, the whole thing may have been a premeditated act of barbary, which was intended to rake in more money than Webster had ever seen before in her life. I'm inclined to lean towards this version of events. Yes, me too, Danny. If Webster really had made a terrible drunken mistake during a burst of anger, she may well have been tempted to flee the scene immediately, but the fact that she cracked straight on with dismembering the body and then stayed on at the house for quite some time whilst making dodgy business arrangements suggests that this may have been a ruthless and coldly calculated plan. It did feel strange that she asked for an extension of just 3 days after learning that she was to be fired, and maybe this was all the time she felt she needed to pluck up the courage to set the plan in motion. The moral of the story is not to get too carried away when spinning a delicate web of lies. I still maintain that while Kate Webster couldn't escape a prison sentence for theft by deception, she could have escaped a death sentence by pleading complete ignorance to the fate of Julia Thomas. Yeah, I think there were a few exits that she could have taken, but she gambled big. Instead, she dug her own grave by weaving a labyrinthian, nice new word for me there, which confirmed the death of the victim while exposing herself as a compulsive liar. The jury believed the final outcome, but not the causal action. She should have kept things simple when telling her slow-boiled porkies. Speaking as the 3-times winner of the coveted Rotherham Rear of the Year award in the 1990s, I'm well aware of how easy it is to take a small fib way too far. Yes, and that is where we end today's episode. Thank you for being here. If you are listening on Spotify, leave us a review, why not? If you're enjoying the show on YouTube, comment, subscribe, like, all of that grand stuff, and I will see you next time.